In 2023, a viral incident rocked the internet. A police officer, acting out of prejudice, pointed a gun at none other than the beloved Hollywood actor Keanu Reeves during a routine stop in Los Angeles. What followed not only cost the officer his badge, but also revealed an incredibly personal and emotional story tied to Keanu's quiet, life-altering kindness from years before. A kindness the officer had unknowingly benefited from. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories. It was a particularly chilly evening in January 2023. Keanu Reeves, dressed in his usual understated style, a simple leather jacket and jeans, was cruising down Sunset Boulevard on his vintage motorcycle. He had just finished attending a charity event for underprivileged children, a cause that held a special place in his heart. As he approached a red light, the wail of police sirens shattered the night's calm, and a patrol car signaled him to pull over. License and registration, barked Officer Mark Reynolds, a man in his late 40s with a hardened demeanor. Mark had served on the force for over 20 years, but recent hardships, a bitter divorce, custody battles, and financial woes, had left him jaded, with his frustrations spilling over into his work. Keanu, keeping his composure, calmly removed his helmet, his unmistakable face coming into view. Yet instead of diffusing the situation, the officer's bias intensified. "Step out of the vehicle," Mark commanded sharply, his tone accusatory. Keanu complied, making sure to keep his hands in plain sight, but Mark's fingers instinctively tightened on the grip of his holstered gun. What happened next was a blur. Witnesses later described how Mark, visibly agitated and on edge, drew his weapon and aimed it directly at Keanu. Gasps erupted from onlookers as a small crowd began to gather, some quickly pulling out their phones to record the unfolding drama. Keanu, astonishingly composed, raised his hands slightly and spoke in a calm yet concerned tone. "Officer, I'm unarmed. Let's talk this through." His voice carried a steadiness that sought to de-escalate the moment. But no one, not even Keanu, could have foreseen what would happen next. As Mark's superior arrived at the scene, the officer's body cam footage was promptly reviewed. Within minutes, Mark was ordered to lower his weapon and was placed on immediate suspension. The incident exploded online overnight, sparking widespread debates about systemic issues in law enforcement. Years earlier, a random act of kindness by Keanu Reeves had saved Mark's family during one of their darkest times. As the media frenzy grew, this incredible truth slowly began to surface, leaving Mark deeply shaken. In the days after the incident, the story dominated headlines. News outlets buzzed, clips of the encounter flooded social media, and Mark Reynolds found himself at the center of a national controversy. Once a proud officer, he now sat alone in his dimly lit apartment, scrolling through article after article. Each one harshly condemned his actions, labeling him everything from unfit to serve to outright racist. Mark couldn't deny it. He'd been on edge that night, crushed under the weight of his collapsing life. But what he couldn't explain was why Keanu Reeves, the man he had wronged, lingered so vividly in his mind. That name, Keanu Reeves, it felt oddly familiar, tied to a memory he couldn't quite grasp. Meanwhile, true to his nature, Keanu had stayed quiet about the incident. While the world erupted in his defense, he focused on something deeper. He had seen the pain in Mark's eyes that night. It wasn't just anger, it was something more profound, and Keanu couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story than anyone realized. A week later, Mark received an unexpected call from the precinct. He was informed that Keanu Reeves had chosen not to press charges. Mark was stunned. Why? Why would the man he had humiliated, whose life he had endangered, choose mercy? But the surprises didn't stop there. 2 days later, a plain envelope was slipped under Mark's door. There was no sender, no return address. Inside was a handwritten note. "Mark, sometimes the pain we carry makes us act in ways we don't recognize. I've been there too. I hope you find peace. Keanu." Mark read the letter over and over, each word cutting deeper than the last. He didn't feel worthy of such kindness or understanding, not after what he had done. Yet, as days passed, the letter remained on his kitchen table, a silent reminder that forgiveness, even when undeserved, was a gift. Still haunted by a sense of familiarity, Mark couldn't let it go. One night, he dug through old photo albums, desperate to uncover the connection. Then he found it, a grainy photo from nearly a decade ago. His late wife, Susan, was smiling with their daughter at a children's hospital. Standing beside them, holding a stack of gifts, was Keanu Reeves. Mark's breath caught in his throat as memories flooded back. It was Christmas Eve 9 years ago. Susan had been battling terminal cancer, and their family couldn't afford the experimental treatment that might have given her more time. That night, a stranger had come to the hospital, handing out gifts and paying medical bills anonymously. Mark never knew his name, until now. The realization hit him like a tidal wave. Keanu had been there for his family in their darkest hour, and Mark had repaid him with cruelty. Overwhelmed with guilt and gratitude, Mark knew he couldn't stay silent. He had to make amends, not just for Keanu, but for himself. For the first time in years, Mark made a choice. He tucked the letter into his pocket, grabbed his coat, and stepped out into the cold night. He had no plan, no clear destination. Only the hope that he could somehow find the man who had shown him the meaning of grace and redemption. Mark's heart raced as he drove through the city, gripping the wheel tightly, his knuckles white. The letter sat folded in his jacket pocket, close to his chest. He had no idea where Keanu lived, or if he would even get the chance to speak to him. But he was determined to try. The guilt was suffocating. He couldn't stop replaying the moment. The way he shouted, the way his hand had hovered over his gun, and the quiet, composed look in Keanu's eyes. The same man who had saved his family from despair was the one he had treated like a criminal. Mark needed to apologize, to explain, to thank him. After hours of searching, Mark finally arrived at a modest, secluded home on the city's outskirts. A tip from an old friend at the precinct had led him there. He parked his car and sat in silence, staring at the dimly lit windows. His pulse raced. What could he possibly say? Would Keanu even listen? Summoning every ounce of courage, Mark stepped out of the car and walked up the narrow path to the door. The crisp air stung his skin, his breath visible in the cold. He raised his hand to knock, but hesitated. What if this was a mistake? What if he was intruding? Before he could overthink, the door opened. Standing there was Keanu, dressed in a simple hoodie and jeans, his hair slightly tousled, as if he had just woken up. His expression was calm but curious, his dark eyes studying Mark for a moment before recognition flickered across his face. Mark stumbled over his words. "Mr. Reeves, I'm sorry for coming here unannounced. I needed to see you." Keanu stepped aside, motioning for Mark to come in without saying a word. The gesture caught Mark completely off guard. He had expected resistance, maybe even anger, but instead, he was met with quiet acceptance. Inside, the house was warm and inviting, filled with books, art, and a lived-in charm. It wasn't the grand mansion Mark had imagined a celebrity would own. It felt human. Keanu nodded. "I recognized that look, the kind of pain that doesn't let you rest until you face it." The words struck Mark harder than he anticipated. His voice cracked as he struggled to respond. "I don't even know where to begin. That night, I acted out of anger, out of prejudice. I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I needed to tell you how deeply sorry I am." Keanu listened intently, his face calm but unreadable. Mark hesitated before pulling an old photo from his pocket and placing it on the table between them. His hands trembled as he said, This was you." His voice quivered. "Years ago, you were there for my wife and daughter when I couldn't be. You paid for her treatment. You gave us one last Christmas together. I never knew who you were, not until now. And I can't believe His voice broke as he looked down, overwhelmed by shame. Keanu picked up the photo, a faint smile forming as he recalled that Christmas Eve. "I didn't do it for recognition," he said gently. "I did it because it was the right thing to do." Tears welled up in Mark's eyes. "And I betrayed that kindness. I pointed a gun at you. I let my own pain turn me into someone I don't even recognize. How do you forgive someone like me?" Keanu leaned back, his gaze thoughtful. "Forgiveness isn't about excusing someone's actions. It's about releasing the weight we carry. You're here now, facing what you've done, and that takes strength." The room fell silent, the air thick with unspoken emotions. Mark's shoulders shook as years of buried grief and guilt spilled out. Keanu didn't interrupt or judge. He simply listened, his presence steady and grounding. For the first time in years, Mark felt a faint glimmer of hope, as if the crushing weight on his chest was starting to lift. He knew this was only the beginning, but for the first time, he didn't feel completely alone. Somewhere in the quiet, the seeds of redemption began to take root. The silence stretched between them, heavy but necessary. For Mark, it was an unfamiliar kind of quiet, one he had avoided for years by drowning his pain in anger and bitterness. Now he was face to face with the very person who had shown him compassion during his darkest hour. Finally, Keanu broke the silence. His voice was calm, but his words carried weight. Pain has a way of breaking us or building us. From the looks of it, yours has been tearing you apart. Mark nodded, his throat tight. I don't even know who I am anymore. After my wife passed, everything fell apart. My daughter stopped speaking to me, and I threw myself into work, thinking it would distract me. But it didn't. It only made me colder, angrier. Keanu leaned forward, his gaze steady but compassionate. Grief does that. It isolates us, makes us believe we're alone. But you're not alone, Mark. You weren't then, and you're not now. Tears burned in Mark's eyes as he looked down at his hands. I thought I was doing the right thing, serving my community, protecting others. But somewhere along the line, I lost sight of what really mattered. I let my pain make me bitter. That night, when I saw you, I didn't see a person. I saw someone to blame, someone to take my anger out on. I don't even know where to start fixing this. Keanu sat back, his expression contemplative. You start by forgiving yourself. Then you do better. You can't undo the past, but you can choose how to move forward. The words hit Mark like a revelation. Forgive himself? He had never even considered it. His entire life had been a cycle of impossible standards and punishing himself for every mistake. But now, sitting across from someone who had every reason to resent him but didn't, he wondered if forgiveness was possible. Keanu stood and walked over to a bookshelf, pulling out a worn journal. Handing it to Mark, he said, "This helped me once. I wrote down everything, no matter how messy or painful it was. It gave me clarity. Maybe it'll help you too." Mark took the journal, its weight heavier than he expected. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Keanu offered a small, reassuring smile. "It's not too late, Mark. For anything." As Mark left that night, the weight on his shoulders felt a little lighter. He drove aimlessly, the city lights blurring past him, lost in thought. For the first time in years, he felt something he hadn't dared to feel: hope. The next morning, Mark made a decision, not just to change, but to make amends. He started with his daughter, Emma, whom he hadn't spoken to in months. On a rainy Saturday morning, he stood on her porch, flowers in hand, rehearsing what he would say. When the door opened, there she was, her eyes widening in surprise. "Dad," she asked, her voice tinged with disbelief. Mark swallowed hard. "Emma, I've been a terrible father. I let my grief push you away, and I'm so sorry. I want to fix things if you'll let me." Emma hesitated, her emotions clear on her face. Then, to Mark's astonishment, she stepped forward and hugged him tightly. "I missed you," she whispered. Word of Mark's transformation began to spread quickly. He made the decision to resign from the police force, choosing instead to work with at-risk youth, helping them navigate the struggles he had once ignored. The road ahead was long and filled with challenges, but Mark faced them head-on, carrying the lessons he'd learned from Keanu. Keanu, for his part, continued living his life with quiet grace, never seeking recognition for the lives he touched. But when he saw Mark on the news months later, speaking to a group of teenagers about the dangers of letting anger consume you, he couldn't help but smile. Sometimes, the greatest transformations come from the most unexpected places. Months passed, and Mark's life became unrecognizable. Each morning, he woke with purpose, dedicating himself to helping the children he had once overlooked. He had become a mentor at a youth outreach program, offering guidance to kids teetering on the edge of despair. Their stories mirrored his own, lost, angry, searching for hope. Despite his progress, the nights were still the hardest. He often lay awake, haunted by memories of his late wife Susan and the choices that had driven a wedge between him and his daughter for so long. Emma, though hesitant at first, had slowly begun rebuilding their relationship. Their weekly dinners had become a ritual, filled with laughter and stories, but Mark knew he still had a long way to go to fully earn her trust. One evening, while sifting through old belongings in his attic, Mark stumbled upon a box he hadn't touched in years. Inside were keepsakes from his marriage, Susan's favorite scarf, letters they had written to each other, and a framed photo of the three of them at the hospital that Christmas Eve. He sat there for hours, lost in memories, until his phone buzzed, pulling him back to the present. It was a text from Emma. "Dinner tomorrow. I want to talk about something important." Mark's heart raced. It wasn't like Emma to be vague, and he couldn't shake the feeling that this conversation would be life-changing. The next evening, they met at a small cafe they frequented. Emma was already seated, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea. Her expression was unreadable. "Hey, sweetheart," Mark said, sliding into the seat across from her. She gave him a small smile, but didn't meet his eyes. "Hi, Dad." The silence between them was heavy, and Mark felt a lump form in his throat. "What's on your mind?" he asked gently. Emma took a deep breath, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of her napkin. "I've been thinking a lot about Mom lately, about everything we went through back then, and about you." Mark's chest tightened. "Emma, I know I let you down," she said, looking up at him with glistening eyes. "I wasn't there when you needed me most, and I'll never stop regretting that." Her voice cracked, and she continued, "It's not just that, Dad. I've been angry for so long, and I didn't think I'd ever be able to forgive you. But seeing how hard you're trying, how much you've changed, it's made me realize something." Mark leaned forward, his heart pounding. "What is it?" Emma hesitated, then reached into her bag and pulled out a worn envelope. "I found this while going through Mom's things. It's addressed to you." Mark's hands trembled as he took the envelope. The handwriting on the front was unmistakable, Susan's. His eyes filled with tears as he carefully opened it and unfolded the letter inside. "Letting people in, letting them help carry the load. Promise me you won't let the darkness consume you. Promise me you'll fight to find the light again, for yourself and for Emma. You're a good man, Mark. You just need to believe it. With all my love, Susan." Mark's vision blurred as he read Susan's letter, his chest heaving with sobs. Emma reached across the table, placing her hand gently over his. "I think she'd be proud of you, Dad," she said softly. He couldn't speak. Words escaped him as a storm of emotions coursed through him. All he could do was hold her hand, silently hoping she could feel the depth of his gratitude. That night, as Mark lay in bed with Susan's letter tucked safely under his pillow, he felt something he hadn't in years, a sense of peace. He finally understood what Keanu had meant about forgiveness and redemption. It wasn't about erasing the past, but learning to live with it and choosing to move forward. But life, as Mark had learned, was never predictable. A few weeks later, Mark received a phone call that would change everything again. It was Keanu. "I've been thinking about your story," Keanu said, his voice warm yet serious. "There's something you should know. It might not be easy to hear, but it's important." Mark's heart raced. "What is it?" Keanu hesitated, then said, "It's about that night at the hospital and what happened afterward. There's a part of the story you don't know." Mark's breath caught in his chest. There was more to the story. "What don't I know?" Mark asked, gripping the phone tightly. Keanu's voice was calm but tinged with emotion. "I didn't just help your family that night, Mark. I was at that hospital for a reason. I'd been visiting someone close to me, someone who didn't make it." Mark's mind raced as the weight of Keanu's words settled heavily on his shoulders. "I'm so sorry," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Keanu sighed softly. "It was my sister, Kim. She was fighting leukemia. That night, I was bringing her Christmas gifts, hoping to make her smile, even if only for a little while. But when I saw your family, saw the love you had for Susan and Emma, even in such a difficult moment, it reminded me of why I was there. Your wife's laughter, the way your daughter held her hand. They gave me something I hadn't felt in a long time." Mark's throat tightened as he pictured Keanu, the quiet figure in the corner of that hospital room, his pain hidden behind an easy smile as he handed out gifts. "Keanu, I don't even know what to say," Mark said, his voice thick with emotion. "I can't believe you were going through something so personal, and still found it in you to help us." "It wasn't about me," Keanu said simply. "It was about doing what I could in that moment. But here's the thing, Mark. I didn't think much about it afterward. I didn't expect it to change anyone's life. But when I saw you that night on the road, I realized how much pain you were carrying. It hit me that even the smallest kindness can ripple in ways we don't expect." Mark's eyes burned with tears. "You saved my family that night. You gave us a chance to make memories we wouldn't have had otherwise. And now, you're helping me see how to put the pieces of my life back together." Keanu's voice softened. "You're doing the hard work, Mark. You're making the choice to change, to heal. That's what matters." They spoke for a while longer, the conversation flowing through memories, regrets, and hope. By the time the call ended, Mark felt lighter, as if a burden he hadn't even realized he was carrying had been lifted. Days turned into weeks, and Mark threw himself into his work at the outreach center, channeling his energy into helping others. He began sharing his story with the kids he mentored, opening up about his mistakes and the lessons he had learned. Slowly but surely, he began to see the impact his honesty was having, not just on the kids, but on himself. One evening, after a particularly long day, Mark returned home to find a package waiting for him. Inside was a book titled Of Kindness, Stories That Change Lives. Tucked inside the front cover was a handwritten note. Mark, the smallest acts of kindness can leave the deepest marks. Keep paying it forward. Keanu. Mark smiled, his heart full. He placed the book on his nightstand, knowing he'd read it later. For now, he sat down and wrote a letter to Susan. My dearest Susan, I'm trying every day. I'm trying to be the man you believed I could be. Emma and I are finding our way back to each other, and I think you'd be proud of her. She's strong, just like you. And though I'll never stop missing you, I finally understand what you meant when you said to find the light again. Thank you for believing in me, even when I couldn't. Forever yours, Mark. As he folded the letter and placed it in the box with Susan's keepsakes, Mark felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. Life wasn't perfect, but it was real. And for the first time in a long time, it was filled with hope, connection, and a promise to make every moment count.